Welcome classic rock fans to another ranking video, a worst to best so to speak. And today we're looking at Peter Gabriel, the studio albums. I'm not going to include his soundtrack work in this video, so I count about 10 albums I think. Anyway, if you're new to this channel, please do click like, subscribe, check that notification bell and check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. Anyway, enough of this flim flam, let's just get on with it, shall we? Number 10 is New Blood from 2011. New Blood saw Gabriel and arranger-composer John Metcalfe revisiting Gabriel's past glories and rebuilding them as orchestral works, with Gabriel adding world-worn vocals to the compositions. And therein lies the problem as far as I'm concerned, because most of these songs are stripped, I think, of their original potency. Red Rain becomes an annoying sonic drizzle, Don't Give Up sounds like karaoke at a posh dinner party, and Salisbury Hill, well, that becomes a bit of a climb. Stripped of that wonderful jangle and strum of acoustic guitars, it just begins to sound a bit limp, I think. Number 9 is Scratch My Back from 2010. This is a covers album, of course, and covers albums are already on shaky ground as far as I'm concerned. Very few of them work really well. Possible exception being those wonderful collaborations between Johnny Cash and Rick Rubin's, Nina Simone's Here Comes the Sun, and perhaps one of my personal favourites is Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, Kicking Against the Pricks. The album is more successful when it stays close to the original compositions like Lou Reed's Power of the Heart or Magnetic Field's A Book of Love. However, the more he digresses from the original composition, the more challenging it becomes, shall we say. For example, Street Spirit Fade Away by Radiohead is just a mangle. Interestingly, Radiohead pulled out of the reciprocal and I'll Scratch Yours. I wonder why. Number 8 is Peter Gabriel from 1978, aka Scratch. This album feels a tad rushed, probably because it was recorded within 6 weeks, I believe. It feels a lot more stripped back than its predecessor, and it's certainly an album that places Gabriel within that milieu of post-punk bands and artists. It is a lot sparser, it's got a harder sound, and Gabriel's writing is far more direct, his vocals less tricksy, shall we say. That's not to say there aren't some extraordinary moments of beauty on this album. I particularly like Roy Bittan's piano, and Robert Fripp's incessant yet low-key guitar squall. And speaking of Robert Fripp, I think his production style is a major contributor to the character of this album. Interestingly, one critic wrote of this album, Robert Fripp's production is feel-wise less intense than Ezrin's, and there are fewer moments of transcending brilliance, but the inspired, well-structured and arranged songs, consistently infused with the elegiac sensitivity and emotion, are ample compensation. Bob Ezrin declined to produce this album, and Robert Fripp preferred a more spontaneous sound, shall we say, and some of it works really well. But then Gabriel always said that the second album would be far more experimental. He wanted something edgier. But it's an album for me that doesn't quite meet its potential. I mean, I like the Bowie-esque art rock and roll of On the Air, but the less said of the synth-heavy white reggae of A Wonderful Day in a One-Way World, the better, quite frankly. Exposure is interesting because it's wrapped in Robert Fripp's signature Frippatronics. And there are, of course, great moments on this album, but it's an album that doesn't quite gel with the listener. On this first album, we had that intoxicating, messy creativity, and the third album offers us this glorious sense of cohesion. But this one feels a little bit half-baked, an experiment that just doesn't quite work. One of the highlights of this album is Home Sweet Home, which begins like a conventional ballad, but it's one that reflects upon the doomed relationship of Bill and Josephine. Its gloomy subject matter, of course, is reminiscent of Roxy Music's In Every Dream Home a Heartache. There are some undoubtedly dark moments on this album. And interestingly, Nick Kent, after hearing Mother of Violence, likened Gabriel to Travis Bickle from the film Taxi Driver. And number 7 is Up from 2002. This is an album that's obviously influenced by the industrial clatter of bands like Nine Inch Nails, which seriously affects the atmosphere on this album. Best described as shimmering menace. The track Darkness, originally titled House in the Woods, Gabriel was determined to open this album with a fairly uncomfortable track, shall we say. He said it's a musical version of a fairy tale and getting lost in a dense forest of tangled thoughts. That is before you inevitably approach a clearance where all your fears are confronted, and the music certainly reflects this. The squalling guitar sound of David Rhodes is certainly a nod, I think, to King Crimson's 21st Century Schizoid Man. and these squalls punctuate this occasionally impenetrable album. Interestingly, Pitchfork criticised the second half of this album as being shapeless. The Guardian accused Gabriel of prog and nincompooperi, and the production does feel a tad claustrophobic, which thematically is probably relevant here, and certainly in keeping with the atmosphere of the album. Growing Up has excellent lyrics and deals with the brevity of the life cycle. Sky Blue is the album's standout track, in my opinion, and is made even more so by the fact it includes the legendary Fleetwood Mac guitarist Peter Green. I mean, some of the tracks like the trash TV satire, the Barry Williams show, which certainly feels out of place here. Overall, this album, like most Peter Gabriel albums, has artistic merit. But it's a sombre, insular affair, and I think many will find it quite a dense and difficult trudge. Number 6 is Peter Gabriel from 1977, aka Car. Gabriel was exploring different ideas for this, his first post-Genesis album, whilst his former bandmates were wallowing in the autumnal tones of Wind and Wuthering. Interestingly, Peter Gabriel's biographer David Easley said Gabriel was enthralled with the pre-EMI Sex Pistols and their Vivienne Westwood designed garb. He was also enthralled by the bombast of the Springsteen and the E Street Band. In fact, he would recruit Roy Bittan to play on his second album. This, in the words of Rolling Stone magazine, saw Gabriel transform himself from theatrical cult artist to canny minimalist pop star. And they are not wrong as we witness this fascinating reinvention of avatar of post-punk in the late 70s. The heavy colorised image of Peter Gabriel sitting in Storm Thorgerson's rain-soaked car for the Hypnosis sleeve not only lent the album its unofficial title, but also adds a kind of mysterious, melancholic air from the get-go. And Gabriel employs a wealth of talent for this album. Some names included Bob Ezrin as producer, of course, after the mercurial Todd Rundgren passed on the project, but also former Mountain drummer Alan Schwartzberg, who certainly makes his presence felt on this record. What an incredible drummer he is. And who could forget that wonderful shuffle beat he adds to Gloria Gaynor's disco hit Never Can Say Goodbye from 1974. The album begins with the intriguing Moribund the Burgermeister, which feels like a little bit of a carryover from that silly band. And it was this that draws in Robert Fripp, apparently, who plays on this album. Although, unfortunately, Robert Fripp didn't get along with Bob Ezrin, telling Alan Jones of Melody Maker, "It was a very demoralising and depressing experience. I found it difficult to work with that producer. I couldn't express myself fully in the circumstances. It wasn't Robert Fripp on that album." Personally, I feel this album stumbles a little bit the doo-wop of Excuse Me, as well as the prog cocktail lounge jazz of Waiting for the Big One. It doesn't really do it for me. But it does end with the stirring Here Comes the Flood, which burns with an anthemic intensity, which is a clear indication of things to come. And Tony Levin, who works fantastically against Robert Fripp and Alan Schwartzberg, creates a thrilling palette of shades and intrigue. And one feels that he's trying too hard to distance himself from his former band, waving adieu from the top of Salisbury Hill. It is obviously a song that touches upon his time at Genesis. The line, "walked right out of the machinery," certainly alludes to that. In fact, it's an echo, I think, of an interview he gave in 1975 where he says that Rael feels as if he's a waste of material, part of the machinery. As a point of interest, Bob Ezrin did not like the hook line in Salisbury Hill, which in its embryonic form was, "Son, make your life a taxi, not a tomb." He felt the language was ugly and insisted on something far more poetic. It wasn't until the final stages of mixing this song that they eventually changed it to, "Grab your things, I've come to take you home." This is a strange, remarkable yet flawed album, but nevertheless a foreshadowing of greater things to come. Number 5 is I.O. from 2024. Peter Gabriel has sprinkled tracks from this record like stardust every full moon. 2 separate mixes, one bright, one dark. Steady drip, building anticipation. Some speak of a kind of innate moodiness. Others a few upward-looking numbers, like glimmers of hope in the darkness, like a full moon, in fact. Numbers like Road to Joy, Love Can Heal, This Is Home. Wonderful numbers. I love this album. But I'm not going to speak about it at length here because I've already done a full review of this album, and I'll put a card up there for you. Nevertheless, 5 is Gabriel's most recent album, I.O. And number 4 is So from 1986. This album hit hard, like a sledgehammer in fact. that willfully brash, slightly naughty single, a number that certainly engorged Gabriel's coffers, I think, as well as proving that Phil Collins does not have the monopoly on sharp-suited, horn-driven, yuppie-era R&B. The offending number, of course, was actually an Otis Redding-inspired soul pop toe tapper. Fascinating video, of course, which we all remember. Interesting, one of the guys that worked on that video was Nick Parks from Wallace and Gromit fame. And Red Rain is one of the standout tracks on this album, which begins with Copeland's hi-hat clatter, putting to bed the no metals rule that was certainly in place for the previous albums. This album has been described by AllMusic as a stately anthem, and it's hard to disagree with that. And with its descending melody line, it serves as an oral metaphor for this apocalyptic image, this coming down, so to speak. I come to you with defences down, he confesses with the trust of a child. I mean, this is a far cry from the sexual aggrandizement of a Sledgehammer. Voice again has an exquisite Birds-like pop jangle to it. I think it was co-written with David Rhodes. And Mercy Street is another of the album's heartfelt numbers, inspired by the confessional writings of American poet Anne Sexton. And interestingly, you hear that gentle lilting rhythm in her poetry is perfectly imitated in this song. And the volume of her poetry that particularly impressed upon Gabriel was To Bedlam and Part Way Back, published in 1960. Then, of course, we get that wonderful number with Kate Bush, which is not only a standout track on this album, but it's a genuine, heartfelt number. On this album, we get the perfect blend of Gabriel's melodicism and a wash of jangly pop, moody art rock, as well as African rhythms. It's easy to see why this album was so popular, I think. It is a perfect blend of pop pretensions, artiness and world music. With a beautiful portrait of Gabriel on the front cover, a portrait by Trevor Key. Now, Trevor Key was responsible for that wonderful photograph of the bell that adorns Micah Oldfield's Tubular Bells from 1973, I believe. The portrait on this cover is all clean lines, framed in white, almost like the music on the album. Number 3 is Us from 1992. This is very close to being my favourite Peter Gabriel album. In fact, I agree with alt rock chick when she writes, "What is unusual about Us is that it's an emotionally honest work from a man who seemed to go out of his way to mask emotion through ornate poetry, clever bits of phrasing and obscure symbolism." In fact, Gabriel himself said of this album, "Much of this record is about relationships. I'm dedicating it to all those who have taught me about loving and being loved." This album exudes vulnerability with songs like Come Talk to Me, which is about the distance between him and his daughter and his fight to get through to her, as well as songs like Love to Be Loved, which is a moody number written during his divorce. I don't think Greg Cott was a big fan of this album. He wrote, "Its opaque melodies and exotic rhythms reward the patient listener, but not without a struggle." I fundamentally disagree with that. That's certainly not my experience of this album. The production on this album is pristine, clean and immaculate, and the music subtle and shaded, with the exception of the Sledgehammer rewrite that is Steam, or the rather suggestive Kiss That Frog, an idea that Gabriel developed after reading The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales, a 1976 book by psychologist Bruno Bettelheim. The music on this album is exquisitely textured and muted, which probably explains why it failed to capture the mass appeal that So had. And it is relentlessly sober as he experiments with submerging the usual exotic sounds and percussions beneath what AllMusic describes as crawling tempos and measured atmospherics. Washing of the Water epitomises this album's emotional heart, and I particularly like the duos he does with Sinead O'Connor, particularly Blood of Eden. Interesting, an early version of this song was actually given to Wim Wenders for use in his 1991 film Until the End of the World. Number 2 is Peter Gabriel from 1982, aka Security. Stephen Thomas Erlewine of AllMusic insisted that this album continued where the third Gabriel album left off, sharing some of the same dense production and sense of cohesion, yet lightening the atmosphere and expanding the sonic palette. Which is certainly more positive than what was said in Record Mirror, I think, at the time. They said, Gabriel walks a fine line between brilliance and churning out a load of old cobblers. Gabriel's fourth album is dark and dense, and it's built on percussive textures. In fact, the opening track, Rhythm of the Heat, it erupts into a flurry of Ghanaian drums. I Have the Touch and the Family and the Fishnet are notable for the same reason. They're propelled by the forceful and eerie rhythms. And these percussive textures use as tonal colouring and enhance the use of synths on this album. Interestingly, Mike Rutherford said in his autobiography that Pete had always been a frustrated drummer and was very rhythmically aware. Security is no doubt a powerful listen, and it's one that demonstrates Gabriel's mastery of tone, style and substance. Shock the Monkey was the big hit, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Peter Hamill actually contributes backing vocals on this one. And of course Brian Grant directed that very strange promo video. Gabriel said it was a love song that explores jealousy. However, Gavin Martin, writing for NME, was not particularly impressed. His music sounds like he's serving penance for the impurity and decay of the entire Western world. What are we going to do with these art house bores? Again, I often find myself disagreeing with NME and Rolling Stone magazine. I think this album is absolutely sensational. And number one is Peter Gabriel, Melt from 1980. Dave Gregory said of this album, Peter Gabriel 3 runs the gamut of all emotion. It begins with a burglary and ends up with an anthem, with all human points in between. There are certain albums in an artist's career that provide a demarcation point where everything afterwards is going to be different, and it's going to change their relationship with their past material. Stevie Wonder's Inner Vision would be such an album, as well as Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. I think this album, Melt, is that album for Peter Gabriel. The sound of this record is extraordinary. Of course, Gabriel didn't want any cymbals used at all, finding them a little bit too splashy. It gave the record a cavernous vacancy and a kind of spaciousness for Gabriel to explore other sounds like vocal ticks and strange percussive textures. It is a tense and claustrophobic atmosphere on this album, exacerbated by Maurice Pert's drum patterns and Larry Fast's unsettling synths, all accompanied by Gabriel's block chords on the piano. No Self-Control is very much defined by the looped guitar of Robert Fripp floating there on a twist of Maurice Pert's xylophone. We get the dystopian I Don't Remember, which smacks down any idea of brightness with a rubber hose. Modern world paranoia right there, certainly tapping into the atmospheres already explored by albums like Gary Numan's Replicas and Pink Floyd's The Wall. Interestingly, Darrell Easley says of this song, it is a reflection of the conservative backlash to the seemingly doomed liberalism espoused in the 60s and 70s. Interesting Family Snapshot was inspired by Gabriel reading Assassin's Diary by Arthur Bremer, who shot at Alabama Governor George Wallace in May 1972. And the wonderful, wonderful Games Without Frontiers, which was actually inspired by the BBC TV programme It's a Knockout, and its European equivalent, of course, which was Jeux sans frontières. Excuse my naff French pronunciation, but that's, of course, the phrase that Kate Bush uses to punctuate the song with. Gabriel was certainly attracted to the symbolism of world leaders in that context, thrashing out their differences, the subtext being that war is perhaps the silliest game of all. And then we get Biko, which is a remarkably anthemic number. Interestingly, Dorian Linsky points out in his book 33 Revolutions per Minute that Gabriel was not the first musician to reference Steve Biko. If I may refer to my notes, in 1978 Tom Paxton did so in the Death of Stephen Biko from his Heroes album, and Tapazuki on tribute to Steve Biko on the album Peace in the Ghetto. And for you prog hounds out there was that track on that Peter Hamill album, A Bike Ride in Africa, I think it was called. It was from his The Future Now album and contained the lines, the bodies of Biko and the Soweto Poor. Anyway, there you are. So Melt is my number one Peter Gabriel album. Let me know what you think of my ranking in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, please do share it, like, subscribe and do all that stuff. And I shall leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.